The daily duties of Roman aqueduct keepers. If you were to walk through a Roman city in its prime, say, the 2nd century CEU, would almost certainly notice the water. Not in the way you notice a fountain today, trickling in a plaza for decoration, but in its sheer abundance. Fountains gushed at crossroads. Public baths steamed with heated pools. Stone basins brimmed with running streams. Houses belonging to the wealthy had pipes that carried water directly indoors. It was a marvel, so ordinary to Romans that they scarcely thought of it, and yet so rare in the wider ancient world that outsiders could hardly believe it. Behind this constant supply stood one of Rome's greatest engineering achievements, the aqueducts. Long lines of stone channels, sometimes soaring across valleys on arches, sometimes buried beneath hills, carried fresh water from distant springs into the heart of the city. At their peak, Rome had 11 major aqueducts feeding the metropolis, with a combined flow measured not in buckets, but in tens of millions of gallons each day. The capital was not alone. Other towns, garrisons, and colonies across the empire had their own smaller systems, ensuring that Roman life, wherever it planted itself, was watered. But such systems did not maintain themselves. Water does not simply run downhill in neat fashion without oversight. Channels crack, lime builds up, debris blocks tunnels, and always, people are tempted to tap into the flow illegally. To keep the water moving, to preserve Rome's miracle of abundance, someone had to watch over the aqueducts. That someone was the curator aquarum and the host of workers under his command, the aqueduct keepers, or in Latin, the aquati. These were not glamorous positions. Few poets sang about them, yet without them the fountains would dry, the baths would empty, and the life of Rome would wither. Imagine, then, that you are one of these men. Perhaps you are a freedman, once enslaved, now employed by the state in this humble but steady role. Your task is simple on paper. Ensure that water flows from source to city. In practice, it means long days of walking, climbing, inspecting, and occasionally confronting people who would rather you looked the other way. The aqueducts begin far from the city. Springs and rivers are captured in carefully built catchment basins, designed to funnel clean water into the first channel. Here, your work might involve checking that no sediment has built up, no animals have muddied the source, no tree roots threaten the walls. Rome prized clarity in its water. Murky supplies were a sign of poor management. Once in motion, the water passes into channels lined with concrete, brick, or stone. Often these are underground for protection. But when terrain demanded it, the channels stride across open valleys on high arches. You know the sound of water rushing within, muffled but steady. As an aqueduct keeper, you learn to listen for problems, the faint hiss of a leak, the sudden quiet of a blockage. One of your constant concerns is lime. The mineral deposits from hard water gradually build along the channel walls, narrowing flow. You and your colleagues chip away at this scale, hauling the fragments out bucket by bucket. It is tedious, back-straining labor, done in tunnels where the air grows damp and cool. Lanterns sputter, tools echo. Yet without this work, the channel would choke within a few seasons. Then there are the thieves. Rome's laws strictly forbade unauthorized tapping of aqueducts. Yet the temptation was strong. Farmers along the route might bore holes to irrigate fields. Urban households might bribe a workman to connect a hidden pipe. Even entire workshops tried to siphon supply, powering mills or filling vats. For this reason, the Aqueduct not only repaired channels but patrolled them, checking for suspicious new outlets. If caught, offenders faced fines, confiscation, or worse. At the top of the system stands the curator aquarum, often a senator or equestrian appointed for a fixed term. His name might be inscribed on aqueduct repairs, immortalizing him as steward of the city's lifeblood. Beneath him, however, the real daily labor fell to dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men like you. Records from the empire list entire teams: surveyors, stonemasons, pipefitters, cleaners, guards. Together they made the miracle ordinary. The importance of their work was never clearer than in crisis. Consider a drought. If a source dried, you had to reroute from another, balancing flows. Consider an enemy attack. In sieges, cutting aqueducts was a first move. Your vigilance might mean the difference between a city holding or surrendering. Even in peacetime, an outbreak of disease could spark rumors that the aqueducts were to blame. You would be called to inspect, reassure, and repair. The water's journey did not end at the city gate. Distribution was an art unto itself. Great reservoirs called castella received the incoming flow, dividing it through pipes of lead, terracotta, or stone. Some went to public fountains, others to baths, and a select share to private homes of the wealthy. You might be sent to inspect a castellum, ensuring that the allocations matched official decrees. Too much to a senator's house could mean too little for a crowded neighborhood pool. The politics of water was as real as the flow itself. Day by day, the duties repeat. Walking miles of channel, climbing scaffolds, descending into tunnels, carrying tools, filing reports. The public rarely thanks you. They simply expect water to flow as though it were a law of nature. Yet in quiet moments you might reflect that the empire itself rests upon your work. Soldiers can march, bread can be baked, baths can soothe muscles, all because you and your fellows keep the water moving. Pliny the Elder, that indefatigable compiler, once wrote that the aqueducts were Rome's greatest achievement, greater even than roads or temples. He admired their scale, their endurance, their gift of health. He might have added, had he thought of you, that they were also a triumph of daily diligence. For what use is a channel without a keeper? As evening falls, you return to the city. The aqueduct arches catch the light of the setting sun, glowing golden above the fields. Children splash in fountains. Old men argue by the baths. The water flows, unceasing, anonymous, yet binding all together. You know the cost of this constancy, endless hours of unnoticed labor, and so a thought lingers as you set aside your tools. Did Rome conquer the world because of its legions? Poor because of its keepers, who quietly ensured that every soldier, every citizen, had water to drink. Would you like me to continue with Section 2 of Story 10, 1,500 to 2,000 words, where we'll explore the challenges of maintenance, corruption in water distribution, and the subtle politics of aqueduct? If you stand at the foot of an aqueduct arch, craning your head back until your neck protests, it is easy to think of the structure as permanent. Its stones are massive, its mortar thick, its channel high beyond reach. To a passerby, it looks eternal. But you, the aqueduct keeper, know better. Stone shifts, mortar crumbles, channels clog. What looks immovable is, in truth, endlessly fragile. Your work is defined by this paradox. Rome built to last, yet nothing lasts without care. And so the duties of aqueduct maintenance never cease. The long work of preservation, the most basic task, is cleaning. Each channel collects debris, leaves blown in from trees, silt from the source, twigs, pebbles, the occasional frog or fish swept in by chance. Lime deposits from mineral-rich water coat the sides. Over months, the once smooth channel narrows until the water can no longer run freely. That is when you are sent in with chisels. The job is slow. You move in teams, scraping the walls, filling baskets with hardened flakes. The sound is a rhythm of hammer taps and falling stone. Lantern light glimmers against damp walls. Breathing becomes shallow in the enclosed space. The fragments are carried out, piled up, and sometimes repurposed for lime mortar. By the end of a shift, your arms ache, yet the channel is wider, the flow renewed. Then there is repair. Earthquakes rattle Italy and the provinces alike. A sudden tremor can crack a section of wall or tilt an arch. Heavy rains wash away foundations. Trees push roots into buried conduits. To fix these, your crew mixes new mortar, replaces stones, braces arches with wooden scaffolds. Repairs must be fast, for the city waits for no one. Snow and ice pose other problems in northern provinces. In Gaul or Britain, water might freeze in channels, splitting them apart. Keepers there devised ways to drain portions in winter, or to cover open stretches. In the heat of summer, meanwhile, evaporation reduced flow. Maintenance meant not just fixing damage, but adapting to climate. The invisible flow of power, yet maintenance was only half your duty. The other half was politics, though not in the Senate where orators thundered, but in quiet decisions about who received water and how much. In theory, the rules were clear. Public uses came first. Fountains for drinking, baths for cleansing, latrines for sanitation. After these, private connections could be granted by official permit, usually to the wealthy. These permits, inscribed on bronze tablets, specified how large a pipe one might install. The diameter was carefully measured, since wider pipes meant more flow. But in practice, corruption crept in. A senator might order his pipe widened without authorization. A bathhouse owner might slip coins to a keeper, ensuring that his flows remained generous even when shortages struck. Entire neighborhoods could find their fountains reduced to a trickle while, across town, water splashed extravagantly in a garden pool. The curator aquarium, the high official overseeing the system, was supposed to prevent such abuses. But his post was temporary, and his concerns much fell to you and your colleagues. You were expected to measure pipes, check flows, and report irregularities. Yet you lived among the very people you inspected. Refuse a bribe, and you made an enemy. Accept one, and you risked punishment if discovered. Frontinus, the most famous curator aquaria of Rome, left us a treatise that reveals just how widespread these abuses were. Writing in the late 1st century CE, he lamented that the system had been riddled with illegal taps, secret pipes, and mismanagement. He catalogued the precise capacity of each aqueduct, measured in quinaria, a unit of pipe diameter, and demanded that allocations match reality. To enforce this, he dispatched inspectors with calipers, measuring pipes in the field. He exposed corruption, prosecuted offenders, and for a time restored order. But even he admitted that vigilance must be constant. Water is tempting. It is life, wealth, comfort, and wherever there is temptation, there will be theft. The bathhouses and their thirst. No institution embodied the politics of water more than the Roman bath. These vast complexes were social centers, where citizens bathed, exercised, debated, and conducted business. A single bathhouse could consume staggering amounts of water, hundreds of thousands of liters daily, cycling through hot, warm, and cold pools, then flushed away. For you as a keeper, bathhouses were both pride and frustration. Pride, because they showed the world Rome's abundance. Frustration, because their thirst often left little for fountains. In times of shortage, citizens grumbled that their public supply ran dry, while bathers soaked luxuriously. The balance was delicate. The state insisted that fountains came first. But in reality, powerful patrons funded many bathhouses, and their influence was not easily ignored. Your orders might be to reduce flow to a bath during drought, but you knew that disobeying a wealthy patron could end your career. A day of inspections. Let us imagine one day in your life as you confront this web of duties and temptations. You rise before dawn. Sling your tools over your shoulder, and join two colleagues for a day of inspection along the Aqua Marcia, one of Rome's longest aqueducts. The morning begins outside the city, where the channel cuts through open countryside. Check the arches for cracks. None today, though ivy has begun to creep along one pier. You note it in your wax tablet, to be cleared next week. Further along, you descend into a maintenance shaft, a narrow stone well that drops into the buried conduit. You lower yourself by rope, lantern in hand. The air is cool and damp. Inside, the water murmurs past, clear and steady. But along one wall, lime has built up thick enough to catch your eye. With a chisel, you scrape off a fragment, adding it to your basket. More work for the cleaning crew soon. By midday, you reach the outskirts of the city. Pier pipes branch off toward private villas. One pipe seems suspiciously wide. With your calipers, you measure it to quinaria, larger than the permit allows. You frown. A senator, no doubt, has ordered it widened. Do you report this? You know the law, but you also know the senator's name and his influence. You make another note in your tablet, undecided. Finally, you arrive at a castellum inside the walls. Water gushes into the reservoir, then divides into 3 channels. One to public fountains, one to a bathhouse, one to private homes. You check the gates. The bathhouse channel runs wide open, while the fountains trickles. The keeper here shrugs. He was ordered, he claims, by the bathhouse owner's agent. Again, you write it down. Again, you weigh in silence. Enforce the law, or look the other way. By evening, you are weary, not from walking, but from decisions. The stones you repaired were simple. The water you measured was steady. But the politics, pipes, those are never simple. The question of justice. Sometimes you wonder about fairness. Rome prided itself on law, on order, on the rule of the state. Mute and yet water, the most essential good, often flowed most freely to those already powerful. You, a mere keeper, could not change that. You could only do your duty, keep the channels clear, report abuses, hope that the system, on balance, served the city as a whole. Frontinus wrote with pride that Rome's aqueducts gave water more abundantly than any city of the ancient world. He was right, but abundance does not mean equality. Some citizens still carried buckets from fountains, waiting in long lines, while senators' gardens overflowed. As a keeper, you saw both. You knew, too, that the aqueducts symbolized Rome's strength. To barbarians, they seemed impossible. Rivers tamed, mountains pierced, valleys bridged. Yet you also knew their fragility. A single enemy with a shovel could cut a buried pipe. A single tremor could topple arches. A single bribe could dry fountain. Rome's abundance rested always on vigilance. And so, as you end your day, another thought lingers. Was the true challenge of Rome's aqueducts not building them, but keeping them just? Could water ever flow free of corruption, or would it always follow the channels of power as surely as it followed gravity? Would you like me to continue with Section 3 of Story 10, 1,500 to 2,000 words, where we'll conclude by following the legacy of Roman aqueduct keepers into decline, collapse, and their echoes in later centuries? Flee when you walk beneath an aqueduct. The stones feel immovable. You think of the arches lasting forever, the water flowing without end. But nothing is permanent, not even Rome, and for you, the aqueduct keeper, the long story of water does not end with triumph. It ends slowly with neglect, the first signs of decline by the late 3rd century CE. The empire groaned under pressures from every side. Soldiers on the Rhine and Danube demanded pay. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. Taxes rose. Coins debased, and in this climate who spared thought for lime deposits in a channel, or roots pushing into buried conduits? Repairs grew slower. Stonecutters were drafted for military projects. Funds, once assigned to aqueduct crews, were redirected to fortifications. Corruption grew bolder, with fewer officials to check it. Pipes widened, fountains dried, and keepers like you did what you could with fewer tools, fewer colleagues, and less oversight. The aqueducts still flowed, but their brilliance dimmed. The Gothic siege, the year 537 CE, brought a decisive blow. The Ostrogoths, laying siege to Rome during Justinian's wars, cut the aqueducts. Their strategy was simple: deprive the city of water, weaken its defenses, and force surrender. And it worked. The channels that once roared into Rome fell silent. Without aqueducts, the baths closed, fountains emptied, mills that once ground grain fell still. Rome, which had boasted of water beyond any rival, returned to the Tiber for drinking, washing, and survival. You can imagine what that meant. The river was not pure. It carried waste, dead animals, refuse. To drink from it was to risk sickness. Yet, with the aqueducts severed, there was no choice. Citizens lined the banks, filling jars. Disease spread. The baths, once centers of civic life, became ruins. For centuries after, aqueducts stood as broken monuments. Travelers marveled at their scale, but locals saw them as quarries. Stones were pried out to build huts and churches. Lead pipes were melted down for reuse. What had once been arteries of the city became skeletons. The persistence of water kept a sight. Not everything vanished. In some places, fragments of the system endured. In Constantinople, new aqueducts were built, like the mighty Valens aqueduct, which fed the Byzantine capital. In provincial towns, shorter channels or cisterns remained in use, and always there were keepers' men, tasked with clearing, repairing, watching. Even in decline, the craft persisted. Medieval monasteries built conduits to bring water into cloisters. Arab engineers in Spain revived and improved Roman techniques, building new channels and Noria's water wheels. In these places, the memory of Roman water lived on, passed down quietly by those who maintained it. The aqueducts rediscovered centuries later. During the Renaissance, scholars and engineers marveled at the remains. They traced the old arches, sketched their lines, measured their gradients. The Aqua Claudia, still towering in broken majesty outside Rome, became both symbol and puzzle. Engineers of the Papal States eventually restored portions. The Aqua Virgo, which had survived in fragments, was repaired to feed new fountains, including the famous Trevi. Thus, even after a millennium, water again flowed through channels first cut by Roman hands. And so, the work of aqueduct keepers, though forgotten in name, survived in practice. But chisels, the lime scraping, the patient checks of pipes. These remained part of human water management, reborn whenever cities reached again for rivers and springs. The legacy of boring work, what, then, is the legacy of the aqueduct keepers? Not glory, for their names are absent from triumphal arches. Not power, for they served always. Beneath senators and emperors, their legacy is something quieter. The proof that civilization depends less on great victories than on steady care. A city thrives not only because it conquers, but because someone clears lime from a channel, because someone patches mortar in the rain, because someone, with calipers in hand, checks the diameter of a pipe. Without such people, the baths go dry, the fountains falter, the city stumbles. With them, life flows literally. And though Rome's aqueducts fell silent, their lesson endures. Every modern city that drinks from a faucet or fills a bath rests on the same unglamorous truth. Someone must keep the water moving. Someone must care for what others take for granted. A final reflection as you walk beneath the arches today. Broken but still magnificent, you might ask yourself, was Rome's greatness written in marble or in water? Was it in the roar of armies or the quiet work of keepers? And more curiously, if water is life, and life requires endless maintenance, perhaps the most important history is not the history of emperors at all, but the history of boring, patient people who kept things flowing. That concludes Story 10. The Daily Duties of Roman Aqueduct Keepers. Would you like me to begin Story 11? The Thames Dynasty's tea tax and its sleepy clerks, with Section 1, 1,500 to 2,000 words. The Thames Dynasty's tea tax and its sleepy clerks. Picture yourself in China, sometime in the 8th century. The Thames Dynasty, which began in 618 CE, is at its height. The capital Chang'an is a city of wide avenues, bustling markets, and the hum of foreign traders bringing goods from Central Asia. Here you find silks, spices, horses, Buddhist sutras, Persian glass, and, in increasing volume, tea. Tea is not yet the everyday drink of billions. It is still, in many ways, new. Once, it was a mountain herb, boiled for medicine by recluses and monks. Its bitter taste was valued less for refreshment than for keeping one alert during long hours of chanting sutras or copying scriptures. But by the Thames period, tea was shifting. It was no longer confined to monasteries. It was entering palaces, markets, and households. The drink of monks became the drink of merchants, poets, and courtiers. And as with many things that gain popularity, the government noticed tea as commodity. The Thames court was pragmatic. It had armies to feed, roads to maintain, and officials to pay. Revenue was essential, and every commodity of wide demand offered opportunity. Salt, long before tea, had been a major source of state revenue. Grain, too, was taxed in kind. By the mid-Tang period, tea had reached a similar status. It was no longer a rarity. Plantations spread across southern province, Sichuan, Fujian, and Guangxi among them. Farmers tended rows of tea shrubs plucking leaves, steaming or roasting them, and pressing them into bricks for transport. These bricks were sturdy, easier to move by mule or boat, and became the standard unit for trade. Where there were bricks of tea, there were buyers. And where there were buyers, there were clerks. The birth of the tea tax, the first recorded government intervention into tea, comes in the 8th century. During the reign of Emperor Desan R. 779 to 805 CE, he faced financial strain. Rebellions had weakened central control, and revenues dwindled. Officials proposed new taxism, among them a levy on tea. It began modestly, a fee per brick, collected at transport checkpoints. But like many taxes, it grew. By the 9th century, the state had established official tea markets in major regions, requiring merchants to register and pay before selling. To ensure compliance, bureaucrats set up offices in towns and along river routes. There, clerks recorded weights, stamped papers, and counted fees. You can imagine the scene. A tea merchant, leading a mule train laden with bricks, arrives at the checkpoint. He bows, presents his cargo. A clerk in a faded robe, ink-stained hands, slowly tallies the load. He dips his brush, scratches a note onto bamboo slips or paper, registers. He stamps the merchant's pass with a seal. Then, with little fanfare, he gestures for the next in line. The clerk's world if emperors and generals live in histories of grandeur. Clerks live in histories of paper. Their world was not one of sweeping campaigns, but of ledgers. They woke at dawn, entered the tax office, sat at low desks, and prepared inkstones. Much of their day was repetition, weigh, record, seal, file. It may sound dull, and indeed it was, but such routines kept the empire running. Without these clerks, the revenues faltered. Without revenues, soldiers went unpaid, roads crumbled, canals silted. So in a strange way, the sleepy man at his desk, yawning over a stack of receipts, was holding up an empire, and sleepiness was indeed an issue. Temp clerks, like many bureaucrats across history, worked long hours in dim light, often in cramped offices filled with the scent of ink and mildew. Some accounts suggest clerks dozed at their desks, earning gentle ridicule from superiors. Tea, poor itself ironically, the very item they taxed was their aid. They brewed cups to stay awake, sipping the bitter liquid as they checked yet another brick. Tea and society beyond the tax, of course. Tea was not just a taxable item. It was also shaping culture. The Temp period saw the rise of tea poetry, most famously by Lu Yu, whose classic of tea charging laid out methods of preparation, utensils, and philosophy. To read Lu Yu is to glimpse a world where tea was more than commerce. It was ritual, art, and reflection. Yet, while poets praised tea's purity, clerks reduced it to figures. 1 brick, 1 fee, 10 bricks, 10 fees. The contrast between lofty ideals and boring reality is striking. The monk brewed tea for enlightenment. The merchant sold tea for profit, and the clerk, he counted tea for taxes. The expansion of the taxes, the tax dynasty aged. The tea tax expanded. By the 10th century, its revenues were substantial, second only to the salt monopoly. Some historians estimate it supplied a tenth of the empire's income. The system became more complex, involving not only checkpoints, but state-run offices in major cities, where merchants had to sell portions of their goods to the government before entering private markets. This meant more clerks, more records, more sleepy hours. Offices buzzed with paperwork. Ink brushes wore down. Registers piled up. But the empire endured. Taxes flowed, and tyrannically helped keep the machinery of governance alive. A closing question for Section 1. And so you find yourself in this world, a bustling trade, a rising beverage, and a government eager to channel its popularity into revenue. Behind every mule cart of tea, there is a clerk, brush in hand, dutifully scratching notes into a ledger. But one question lingers. As the 10th state grew more dependent on tea taxes, what pressures and consequences did this bring for farmers, for merchants, and for the clerks themselves? If in the first section we watched the birth of the tea tax, now we step deeper into its mechanics, into the lives of those who bore it, bent it, and sometimes broke under it. Taxes, after all, are never neutral. They shape economies, alter landscapes, and leave marks on people's daily routines, even if those marks are as dull as ink smudges on a ledger. The farmer's burden, let us begin in the hills of Sichuan or Fujian, where tea plants lined terraced slopes. The farmer's year revolved around pruning, plucking, steaming, and pressing. Families worked together, children picking tender leaves, elders drying them, fathers and mothers binding them into dense bricks. On its own, tea farming was laborious but potentially rewarding. Demand was high. Merchants traveled far too by bricks. Yet the state's tax changed the rhythm. Farmers had to account for government inspectors. A portion of their harvest was essentially earmarked for revenue before it even left the village. For poorer households, this meant fewer bricks to sell privately, narrower margins, and the need to plant more simply to keep afloat. Unlike today's clear percentages, the temps tea tax often varied, depending on region and official decree. In some areas, farmers were required to sell a certain number of bricks directly to the government at set prices, often lower than market rates. Elsewhere, merchants bore the tax, but farmers indirectly felt it when merchants offered lower purchase prices to offset their costs. So when a farmer gazed at his carefully tended rows of shrubs, he also saw a looming abstraction, the official seal, the inked brush, the tax that skimmed off his labor before he tasted the reward. Merchants and their workarounds. Merchants faced another side of the coin. They bought bricks from villages, loaded them on mule trains or barges, and carried them to markets. Every journey meant checkpoints. At each clerks tallied, fees were paid, and documents stamped. For the honest merchant, it was an exercise in patience. The process could stretch a journey from days to weeks, as one office after another required inspection. For the less scrupulous, it was a challenge worth outwitting. Smuggling became common, extra bricks hidden beneath declared loads, secret paths around checkpoints, bribes slipped into sleeves of clerks. The Temps state, aware of these practices, expanded its bureaucracy. Further, patrols scouted roads, inspectors cross-checked records, punishments were issued for tea concealment, but enforcement was uneven. Some clerks were diligent, some corrupt, others simply weary. For every caught smuggler, another slipped by. On a moonlit trail, clerks drowning in records now, turn your attention back to the clerks. Their desks, once manageable, now sagged under volumes of registers. Each mule train added lines to the books. Each bribe added moral quandaries. Inkstones required constant grinding, brushes constant trimming. The work was, in essence, endless. Tea was seasonal, but demand stretched year-round, and merchants staggered their shipments to avoid floods of fees. For clerks, this meant a trickle that never ceased. Morning, noon, and dusk, there were bricks to record, seals to stamp, disputes to settle. They grew skilled at repetition. The sound of brush against paper became a rhythm, a background hum. Yet monotony carried risks, miscounts, lost documents, and mistakes that could cost the office dearly. Supervisors demanded accuracy, but clerks were human. Some nodded off mid-end, smudging ink into blots. Others mixed up numbers, sparking disputes. The sleepy bureaucrat became almost a stock figure in Temps anecdotes, diligent yet perpetually tired, eyes heavy under candlelight. T. For the sleepless and, here lies a small irony worth savoring. The very item they taxed tea was their ally. Pre-against exhaustion. A clerk might pause, brew a cup, inhale the steam, and sip, returning to his desk a little sharper. Accounts from the Temps suggest tea became not just a drink of monks and poets, but also of bureaucrats and laborers. The tax thus created a loop. Tea paid for the empire. Tea kept its clerks awake to manage the tax. Tea was the problem and the solution, the burden and the bomb dot. The cultural shift beyond ledgers, the tea tax shaped culture. It pushed tea out of monasteries into markets, and term markets into households. By taxing tea, the state confirmed its importance. A taxed commodity is, by definition, widespread enough to matter. Poets of the Temps captured this dual reality. Some verses celebrated tea's flavor and fragrance, while others hinted at its entanglement with officialdom. The bureaucratic side rarely made for lofty poetry, but it lurked in the background. The stamped paper, the weary merchant, the clerk who, after hours of writing, sought solace in his own small teacup. Tensions and complaint, unsurprisingly, resentment brewed. Farmers complained of unfair prices. Merchants grumbled at checkpoints. Even clerks voiced quiet frustrations, though rarely too loudly. lest superiors accuse them of laziness. Records suggest that in some provinces, protests and petitions emerged. Communities begged for lower rates, exemptions, or relief after poor harvests. Occasionally, the court listened, adjusting rates. More often, it did not. Still, the system persisted. The Temps treasury depended increasingly on tea revenue, especially as salt monopolies faced corruption and other taxes faltered. By the dynasty's later centuries, tea was no longer just a drink. It was a pillar of fiscal survival. Closing question. For Section 2, so you see the pattern. A farmer's weary hands, a merchant's cautious bribe, a clerk's drowsy ink blot. Each bore the weight of the tea tax differently, yet together they kept the empire's revenues flowing. But what happens when a system leans too heavily on a single source? What cracks emerge when farmers, merchants, and clerks alike grow weary, not just of tea itself, but of the endless bureaucracy it demanded? Would you like me to continue with Section 3 of Story 11, the Temps dynasty's tea tax and its sleepy clerks? By now, you have seen the birth of the Temps tea tax and the burdens it placed upon farmers, merchants, and clerks. But no tax lives in isolation forever. It becomes entwined with broader currents, wars, famines, politics, reforms, and eventually it either evolves or dissolves. In this final section, we follow the arc of the tea tax through its strain, its decline, and its surprising afterlife in later dynasties. The weight of reliances the Temps dynasty aged. So too did its dependence on tea revenue. Wars along the frontiers, particularly against Tibet and other powers, drained resources. Court expenditures grew lavish, while natural disasters reduced grain harvests. Tea, however, remained relatively reliable. Its cultivation spread, demand increased, and trade routes flourished. The court leaned into this reliability. Some officials warned against overtaxation, fearing backlash, but others insisted it was one of the few steady incomes left. And so the burden thickened. Tea became not just a drink, not just a culture, but an artery of state finance. Yet every reliance carries risk. Just as salt taxes bred smuggling, so tea taxation fostered evasion. Smuggling routes multiplied. Families developed ingenious ways to disguise tea bricks, sometimes pressing them into shapes resembling innocuous bundles of herbs or firewood. Clerks, no matter how diligent, could not catch everything. The empire gained revenue, yes, but it also cultivated a quiet economy of resistance. The clerk's world expands for clerks. The work grew more sophisticated. By the late Temps, offices introduced more formalized seals and coded tallies to prevent forgery. Double-entry methods, rudimentary precursors to modern bookkeeping, began to appear. The daily monotony deepened, but so did the technicality. A clerk now not only copied numbers, but also verified authenticity, checked for counterfeit stamps, and reconciled ledgers with reports from distant stations. More ink, more paper, more late nights. Imagine sitting at one of these desks, your lamp guttering, your wrist cramping, your head foggy with fatigue. You pause, sip bitter tea, and return to your brush. The rhythm resumes. It is not dramatic, it is not glamorous, but it is history, grinding work that kept empires humming, even as their edges frayed. The farmers push back, meanwhile, in the hills. Farmers sometimes resisted more openly. Archaeological evidence and scattered documents suggest that communities occasionally abandoned tea plots altogether, shifting back to subsistence crops. Others appealed directly to local governors for exemptions. When wars or bandit raids disrupted transport, some villagers simply withheld their teas, daring officials to enforce collection. These acts were rarely revolutionary in intent. They were pragmatic, born of necessity, but they revealed cracks in the system. The empire could decree, could tax, could count, but only to a point. Beyond that, nature, distance, and human will introduced limits. Merchants in the middle, merchants, remained caught between worlds, too wealthy to escape notice, too dependent on state permission to act freely. They endured. Some prospered, building fortunes on state contracts to deliver taxed tea. Others vanished under debt when checkpoints drained their profits. Their complaints echo across dynastic history: taxes too high, bureaucracy too slow, corruption too rampant, and yet they continued to haul tea. Why? Because demand was unshakable. Even as protests simmered, the Chinese love for tea deepened. The empire could wobble, and still households would steep leaves in hot water. Still monks would sip before meditation. Still clerks would brew for wakefulness. The fall of the temps, the rise of new systems by the 9th and 10th centuries. The Tang dynasty was unraveling. Rebellions, such as the Huang Chao uprising, devastated the land. Central authority waned. Regional warlords and governors seized control of taxation in their territories. In this chaos, the tea tax fragmented. Yet here lies the paradox. Though De Teng fell, the idea of taxing tea did not. The subsequent Song dynasty adopted and refined it, making tea revenue even more integral to governance. Later still, the Ming and Qing expanded its scope, embedding tea taxation into the long arc of Chinese fiscal history. The temps clerks, weary and ink-stained though they were, had set a precedent. Their ledgers, their seals, their endless paperwork became templates for centuries of tax collection. The legacy of dull works, so what remains of these clerks and their sleepy records? Very little in names or biographies. They were not generals or poets. Their achievements were not carved in stone, but their ledgers, in fragmentary form, survive. Through them, historians reconstruct trade flows, regional economies, and the empire's fiscal backbone. Their dullness, in a way, preserved history, because they wrote everything down. Every brick counted, every fee logged with glimpse, a past not of emperors and battles, but of ordinary persistence, a reflection on continuity. Perhaps this is the deeper lesson. The temp tea tax was not extraordinary in its drama, but in its ordinary. It reveals how empires are sustained not only by palaces and armies, but by clerks with cramped wrists, farmers with tired backs, merchants with weary mules. Their world was slow, methodical, and often frustrating. Yet through that slowness, they built continuity. Tea carried not only flavor, but also stability tax, revenues flowing, records maintained, cups filled. Even today, when you sip tea, you might unknowingly echo their cycle. The fatigue, the refreshment, the persistence. And while you may not face a temp's clerk's ledger, you to live in a world where paperwork and taxes quietly undergird daily life. Closing thought for story 11. So, as the Temps dynasty faded into memory, its tea tax remained as legacy. It was never glorious, never spectacular. But it reminds us that sometimes the most enduring parts of history are not the battles or the poems, but the sleepy clerks, the steady farmers, and the humble leaves in a cup. And so we might ask, if the Tang clerks could see how far tea has traveled into every continent, every culture, would they smile with recognition, or simply reach for another brush and return to their ledgers? The Venetian glassmakers, who couldn't leave their island Venice in the late Middle Ages, was a city balanced delicately between water and ambition. Built upon wooden piles driven into a marshy lagoon, it lacked the farmland of other powers, but it thrived upon trade. Spices, silks, and stones passed through its markets, making the city wealthy beyond its modest geography. Yet Venice was not only a place of merchants, it became a place of makers. Among these, none stood out more curiously, nor more confined than its glassmakers. The early glimmer of glass itself, was not a Venetian invention. Egyptians, Romans, and Persians had long since melted sand and soda into shimmering vessels. By the time Venice rose to prominence, glassmaking was an ancient craft, passed down through centuries. Yet Venice was uniquely positioned to perfect it. The lagoon provided pure quartz sand, essential for clarity. The city's access to Eastern trade brought soda, ash, and other chemicals, and the Venetians, never shy about borrowing and adapting, took techniques from Byzantium, the Islamic world, and the remains of Rome. But the true Venetian twist lay not in invention, but in refinement. Slowly, artisans transformed their furnaces into laboratories of precision. The fire hazard of a floating city, yet there was a problem, one rooted in Venice's peculiar geography. The furnaces that melted sand into glass burned hot, so hot that wooden beams could ignite from their heat. Venice, with its tightly packed wooden houses and narrow alleys, was especially vulnerable. And so, in 1291, the city made a decision that would define centuries of glassmaking. All furnaces had to move to the island of Murano, a short boat ride from the main city. The official reason was safety, fewer fires threatening Venice's crowded heart. But another motive was surely present: control. By isolating glassmakers on Murano, the state kept its secrets contained. Glass was valuable not just for cups and chandeliers, but for mirrors, lenses, and decoration. It was a commodity worth protecting. Murano, a gilded cage. Murano itself was no grim prison. Glassmakers enjoyed privileges unknown to many Venetians. They could wear swords, a sign of status. They could enjoy immunity from certain prosecutions, bear daughters, in some cases married into noble families. Yet there was a cost. Once established on Murano, glassmakers could not easily leave. Emigration was forbidden. To carry Venetian techniques abroad was treason, punishable in some eras by severe penalties, even death. Thus began the paradox of Venetian glassmakers, both honored and confined, wealthy and trapped. They lived within a gilded cage, their furnaces blazing on an island that was both sanctuary and prison. The dull rhythms of the furnace step into a Murano workshop, and you would not find constant drama. Much of the work was repetition, feeding furnaces with wood, stirring molten glass, shaping endless goblets or beads. The heat was stifling, sweat constant, the rhythm unchanging. A master might experiment, but apprentices spent years doing the same tasks, turning rods, blowing air, cooling pieces. The artistry was real, but so was the monotony. For every masterpiece that survives in a museum, thousands of simple vessels passed quietly into Venetian households. Glass-making, like history itself, was often boring in the details, and yet it mattered. Each vessel carried wealth, prestige, and the imprint of labor. Glass as strategy. Why did Venice value glass so deeply? Because it was more than decoration. Venetian mirrors, made with polished metal backings and clear bubble-free surfaces, became prized across Europe. Lenses, though still primitive, hinted at the possibilities of magnification. Colored glass adorned churches, reflecting wealth in stained window. To control glass was to control a luxury market, and Venice excelled at monopolies. Salt, spices, and glassol carefully managed. The glassmakers, isolated on Murano, became both artisans and strategic assets. A quiet life with global ripples. The glassmakers themselves rarely traveled. They worked, ate, married, and died on Murano, their world bounded by the lagoon's waters. To them, the Grand Republic may have felt distant set of laws and decrees, drifting down from the Doge's palace, yet the objects they made traveled farther than they could imagine. A goblet from Murano might sit on a French noble's table. A mirror might decorate a Spanish queen's chamber. The glass, more than the maker, became the voyager. There is a curious irony in that. The artisans confined, the objects free, the sections closing thought and so. By the end of the 13th century, Murano had become both safe haven and containment zone. Fires no longer threatened Venice, but secrets remained under lock and key. The furnaces roared, the rods spun, the molten glass cooled. Day by day, glassmakers lived within their gilded cage. But what exactly did they create, beyond goblets and beads? What innovations made Venetian glass the envy of the world, so valuable that secrecy seemed worth such rigid control? Would you like to continue to section 2 of Story 12? where we explore the innovations, experiments, and global fame of Murano glass. If Section 1 placed you in the hot, repetitive rhythm of Murano's furnaces, then Section 2 invites you to peer more closely at what those glowing ovens produced. Because while the daily labor might have seemed monotonous to the glassmakers themselves, the results were anything but ordinary to the outside world. Venetian glass, during its peak centuries, gained a reputation so strong that it shaped trade routes, influenced royal courts, and even changed the way people saw themselves literally through mirrors. The secret of Cristolomong I. Great innovations of Murano was the creation of Cristallo, a type of glass prized for its clarity. Until then, much glass had a greenish or cloudy hue, caused by impurities in the sand or ash used. Venetian artisans discovered a method of purifying the ingredients, carefully filtering and refining until they achieved a transparency close to rock crystal. It was, in essence, the first luxury clear glass. To modern eyes, it may not seem extraordinary, but in a world used to clouded vessels, the ability to see wine sparkle or oil shimmer inside a perfectly clear goblet felt magical. The recipe for Cristallo was guarded jealously. Apprentices learned by observation, not by written notes. Secrets passed from master to student orally. And betrayal could mean exile or worse. The language of colorif Cristallo was about purity. Murano's other pride was its palette. By adding small amounts of metal oxides, glassmakers produced vivid colors. Copper yielded rich greens and blues. Manganese deepened purples. Gold dust created ruby tones. Beyond goblets and windows, this mastery allowed the production of beads, tiny works with flower-like patterns frozen in glass. Strung together, they traveled across Europe, Africa, and Asia as both ornaments and currency. On trading voyages, Venetian merchants used them almost like coins, exchanging bright beads for goods far from the lagoon. Thus, the monotony of stirring molten glass had global echoes. A bead made in Murano might cross deserts or jungles, linking Venetian furnaces to distant marketplaces, mirrors and the cult of reflection, perhaps. No innovation gave Venice greater fame or secrecy than its mirrors. By the 15th century, Murano glassmakers had developed a method of applying a thin layer of tin and mercury to the back of glass sheets, creating reflective surfaces far superior to polished metal. The cultural impact was enormous. Nobles, bend, and royals who had once glimpsed only vague outlines of themselves in bronze or water could now study every wrinkle and hair with clarity. Mirrors altered self-awareness, fashion, and even architecture, as interiors glittered with reflection. For Venice, mirrors became goldmines. Their export brought immense profit, but their methods were so tightly protected that smuggling the technique was treated as espionage. Even centuries later, when French entrepreneurs managed to lure a few Venetian artisans to Paris, the scandal rocked Murano. glass as science, though beauty often took the spotlight. Venetian glass also mattered for science. Lenses shaped in Murano were among the best in Europe. They found their way into spectacles, easing the lives of aging readers. Some lenses would later contribute to telescopes and microscopes, opening vast new worlds. It is oddly soothing to remember that such leaps in human knowledge depended, in part, on men sweating before furnaces, endlessly stirring molten sand. Behind every astronomer peering at the stars was a glassmaker, turning rods in the glow of Murano's ovens. The social world of Murano, while Venice grew wealthy on glass. Life for the artisans remained contained. They lived on the island, their days governed by workshop schedules. Some grew rich enough to commission chapels or houses. Others remained simple laborers, tied to the furnaces like peasants to fields. Glass-making families emerged, dynasties of artisans whose names carried weight. Yet prestige came with its cage. A master might dream of Paris or Constantinople, but his feet remained in Murano, while his works traveled on galleys to every corner of the Mediterranean. There is something both noble and melancholy in this. To give beauty to the world, yet never see that world yourself. Imitation and competitions, cess, always invites imitation. Across Europe, rival centers tried to replicate Murano's secrets. Bohemian glassmakers would later rise to fame, offering crystal with a different brilliance. In France, royal workshops attempted to break Venice's monopoly. Even in the Ottoman Empire, artisans experimented with techniques drawn from or inspired by Murano. Venice fought back with law and secrecy. For centuries, Murano maintained its dominance not only through skill, but through careful political control. Yet history, like molten glass, shifts slowly, cooling into new forms. By the 17th century, Venetian glass faced real competition. Though its mystique endured, the sections closing thought so in the centuries after their relocation to Murano. The glassmakers refined techniques that reshaped luxury, science, and culture. From crystal-clear goblets to mirrors that made people see themselves anew. Their work was as practical as it was symbolic. But what of the glassmakers themselves? How did it feel to live in privilege and confinement, to work in furnaces whose heat never cooled, to belong to a world-famous craft, yet remain bound to an island? You now know what the glassmakers of Murano produced: crystal-clear goblets, colored beads, lenses, and mirrors that enchanted the world. But to understand their story completely, you must return again to the island itself, to the people who spend lifetimes near the furnaces, shaping beauty from molten sand, and living lives both privileged and restricted, daily life by the furnaces to imagine the daily routine of a Murano glassmaker. Picture an early morning in the 16th century. The sun is just rising, and already smoke curls from the chimneys of the furnaces. A master enters, his apprentices trailing behind him. The heat never ceases. Furnaces must be kept alive day and night. So even before the men arrive, assistants have fed them with wood or charcoal. The day is measured not by hours, but by the demands of the fire. Teams work in shifts, passing rods and tools in a rhythm born of long practice. Apprentices do the menial tasks, carrying wood, cleaning tools, pitching raw materials. Masters handle the delicate shaping of molten glass, using breaths, rotations, and precise timing. Evenings may bring a meal of bread, fish from the lagoon, perhaps a flask of wine, yet fatigue lingers. Hands are calloused, eyes reddened from glare. Some glass-makers went blind early, staring too long into brightness. The rhythm of their lives was tied not to seasons, but to furnaces' heat in summer, heat in winter, heat forever. Privileges and golden chains, despite hardships, glassmakers enjoyed unusual privileges. They were considered valuable enough to merit rewards denied to other artisans. In Venice, they were allowed to wear swords, a marker of status normally reserved for nobility. They could marry into noble families, blurring the rigid social boundaries of the Republic. Some became wealthy, their families commissioning altarpieces or endowing churches. But privilege came with its chains. Once you became a master, you could not leave Venice without permission. The risk of betraying secrets was too great. Spies and guards monitored for deserters. A runaway might be hunted across Europe, bribed or threatened back into silence. Worse. Thus, the glassmaker's life was gilded yet enclosed, much like the crystal he produced, beautiful, transparent, and fragile. Women and families in men dominated the furnaces. Women played important roles too. Wives and daughters helped manage households and sometimes businesses. Some became decorators, gilding or enameling finished glass. Others participated indirectly, weaving social networks that supported the trade. Children often entered apprenticeships. Sons of glassmakers were expected to continue the craft, binding families to the furnaces across generations. Even daughters, though rarely permitted to blow glass, absorbed the rhythms of furnace life, the late nights, the constant heat. The pride of seeing one's family name tied to Venetian exports. The tension of wealth and isolation by the 17th century. Some Murano masters had grown very rich. They built villas along canals, decorated with glass chandeliers of their own making. Their beads and mirrors adorned palaces in Paris, Istanbul, and Madrid. Yet most glassmakers never saw these cities. They remained on the island, confined by law. Their works traveled in crates aboard Venetian galleys, but their makers gazed across the lagoon, dreaming of lands they would never walk. It is a paradox. Murano glass embodied cosmopolitan luxury, yet its creators lived provincial lives. Their world was at once global and insular. Decline and persistence over time. Venice's monopoly faded. New centers in Bohemia, France, and elsewhere learned to rival or surpass Murano in certain techniques. Global trade routes shifted, and the Republic of Venice itself declined. But Murano endured. Even in reduced circumstances, its furnaces glowed. Glass-making families persisted, adapting styles, inventing new forms, appealing to tourists as much as kings. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Murano reinvented itself again, producing modernist designs and art glass, drawing visitors to marvel at live demonstrations. The tradition never vanished. Walk the island today, and you still hear the hiss of air through blowpipes, still see glowing blobs take form in a craftsman's steady hand. Centuries of knowledge live on in gestures passed from parent to child. A legacy in reflection. What is Murano's true legacy? Not just goblets or beads, though these remain prized, nor merely mirrors, though they altered how people viewed themselves. The deeper legacy is a reminder of how craft shapes culture. Think of the ripple effects. Clear glass made better lenses. Lenses made better science. Science changed how humanity understood the universe. Mirrors reshaped art and vanity, helping people become more skillful. Colored beads carried Venetian influence into distant continents, all from furnaces tended by men who mostly never left their island. It is a strangely humbling thought. World. History shaped by artisans who stirred molten sand day after day, night after night, their sweat glowing in furnace light. Closing reflection. So ends the story of Murano's glassmakers, privileged yet confined, monotonous in their labors yet dazzling in their results. Their lives remind us that history is often built not on great battles or thrones, but on the slow, repetitive work of hands at a furnace. And as you imagine the quiet canals of Murano at night, the glow of fires behind shuttered windows, the clink of cooling glass on wooden shelves, perhaps you wonder, was the true treasure of Murano the beauty it sent abroad, or the stubborn continuity of an island where furnaces never went cold?